Spike, Nurse Redheart by Stitch Down. Like most every day, Spike is helping Twilight at her castle in the library to organize books and other things. But one day, Twilight asked Spike if he could go to the hospital to bring him some medicine for her since she had feeling some bit cold lately. And Spike, he said that he didn't mind, so he actually went to the hospital to get some medicine for Twilight. But when he arrived, he saw that Nurse Redheart was very occupied with other patients and the staff in the hospital didn't have much personnel at the moment. And then he heard that Redheart was actually talking to one of the ponies that they needed some pony to read some stories for the Phyllis and Colt who was in the hospital. But the other ponies there on the staff could said that they couldn't do it because they were occupied with other things to do. And then Spike saw Redheart was feeling disappointment that she had promised the Phyllis and Colts that some pony would read stories for them since they were feeling ill. And then she saw Spike, and she remembers that Spike read the story for the Phyllis at the hospital a while back, and she remembers that. And she asked Spike if he could read for some stories for the Phyllis. And Spike said that he was actually going to take the medicine for Twilight since she needed some for her cold. And Redheart said if he could read some stories for the children, she would send a pony to Twilight with the medicine as return. Spike thought about that idea and accepted it. Spike gave the medicine to a pony which fast left the hospital to back to Twilight's castle. At the same time, Nurse Redheart took with Spike to a room where the Phyllis and Colt were waiting for someone to be reading for them. Redheart explained to the children that the pony that was going to read for them was occupied with something else and couldn't read for them. But then the children started to cry. But then she said, "Spike is here too. He can read for you?" And the children looked at Spike and found a baby dragon. Said one of the children, "How can he read the stories for us? He's just a baby dragon." Spike just smiled and said, "Well, you don't know for sure yet if you don't give him a try." And the children just was quiet, and Spike took a book from the bookshelf and started to read. At first, Redheart was standing there for about a few minutes before she had to call over from the duty. She saw that Spike read the story with excellent story, with different voices for the different characters, and made the story to feel excited and adventure. Redheart has been very interested in Spike for a while, mostly because that he has very much handled well with the handling of the children. And she had been asked by some other staff if they could hire Spike for a part-time job at the hospital to help with the children, like reading stories, just keeping company while the staff is occupied with other duties. And the medical doctors at the hospital thought that idea might be worth a try, but they had to ask Twilight at first because since he is actually her assistant, and if there was a possible that she could spare Spike for a few hours almost every day, and first they hadn't even told about Spike about that. And nearly 4 hours later, Nurse Redheart appeared back in the room. Nurse Redheart was standing at the door, and seeing that Spike was still reading books for the children. She could see that children was very focused on Spike's reading. She was very impressed with Spike that he had actually captured the, attention to the children to the stories. When Spike was finished, he said that he would have to leave, but the children asked him to read some more and more. But he had already had read almost more than half of the stories in the bookshelf. There were only 4 stories left, and but Nurse Redheart told the children that Spike had to go home, but they wanted to stay. But Spike then told them that he could be back anytime soon. In fact, said Redheart, that Spike has been hired by the staff by the hospital to stay here to keep your children company with the stories for you to play games. And that is okay for Twilight. We had asked her and she said it was okay. Spike was very surprised that Twilight had actually was okay with that he isn't at the castle that often anymore. And he then asked Redheart on the way out how many hours he will be at the hospital at the time. And she said between 8 to 10 hours. At the most, maybe less. It depends how much work they should have. And Spike was very surprised of that. And before he left, he said to Redheart that he thanked her for helping Twilight by delivering the medicine, and that he can help her at the hospital anytime. But when Spike left, he actually thought about Redheart, that she is a very kind, beautiful mare, but he had kind of fallen in love with her, but he realized that she is much older than him, and even much older than Rarity and the others. By this point, Spike had already moved on from Rarity since she was dating Pinkie Pie. But during the same night, Redheart was also back home thinking about Spike. She thought that Spike was very kind, very an honest, charming dragon, even if it be a baby dragon. But she hasn't realized then that she actually had been fallen in love with Spike. She had been interested in Spike for the past few months, or for at least a while. And for the next couple of days, Spike actually helped at the hospital by playing some games for the children, playing some stories, and just keeping company. And from down then, Redheart came by to see how Spike was taking care of the children. And the children was always laughing and laughing. And the staff of the hospital could see how much they loved Spike. Even when the children was getting better again, was back to health and had then to go back home, but they wanted to stay so that Spike could still read the stories. But Redheart, she could see how much the children loved Spike so much. But Spike had to let them go home, but he said that they were always welcome back at a visit. In fact, only about a week later, there were almost no children at the hospital, maybe only 2 or 3 children at most. So Spike was not that much occupied so very much at the time. But after that week, he didn't return to the hospital for the next couple of days or at least for several months. For there were not much any children on the hospital, so not at the time. There were only maybe 1 or 2 or 3 the most. So at that time, the staff could handle all the children themselves. But during the winter, When the flu pandemic was running through Equestria, and especially in Ponyville, there were only maybe like from 10 to 40 children at the most who had at the hospital. Then they had to ask Spike to come back to the hospital to help them. And Spike, he didn't mind help. But during this time, Spike had actually fallen in love more and more for Nurse Redheart and she for him. But they hadn't even admitted to each other because Spike knows that even if she likes him more as a friend, she would not even explain that to him because she's like in her 30s and Spike is in almost 10 in pony years. But one day when Spike was going to tell her how much he likes her, then he saw her was talking to someone of his staff. He was actually standing around the corner when he heard them talking. The other nurse told Nurse Hart that she was happy to see her to getting married, or at least being engaged. Spike's heart broke. He didn't expect that Nurse Redheart was getting engaged with another pony. His other second chance to be happy fall apart right there, and before he could even talk to her, he left the hospital quietly without telling others. He said to one other nurse that he didn't feel so well and that he wanted to go home. And the nurse said that she understood and she wished him to be better soon. And Twilight then asked about a few days later if he hasn't gone back to the hospital because they had been asked for him. But this said that Spike didn't feel so well, but Spike seemed to be doing well. But there was something that made him to stay back home. He hasn't even left the castle for nearly a few days. And even his friends were getting a bit worried. Spike then explained to Twilight since what has happened. And Twilight was then asked around. It turns out that Nurse Redheart was in fact were engaged, but she was actually used to be engaged only about 2 months before Spike started working there. Her fiancé had been a trader or a merchant who traveling around to selling goods to other towns in nearby area. But after some time, they had slowly drifted apart. Since they didn't see each other so often, he could be away for days, weeks, and sometimes in months. And even he was back home. They didn't see much because he can go home during the afternoon. She can come home at the evening, sometimes the next morning when he had already went to work. So they just didn't see much each other so often. So that made them drift apart. When Spike was told that, he was happy and surprised. Then Redheart had actually heard about Spike's condition, and she was very worried about Spike, so she actually went to the castle before she went to work. She wanted to talk to him in person. Spike then admitted to her about his true feelings for her, and she admitted the same back way. But they both realized, even that she is like in her 30s and he is like in 10 in pony years, they would not be accepted as in a community. So they decided to keep their relationship as a couple as a secret over for some time to figure out how to admit it to their friends. But Spike had promised Redheart that he will only tell one pony, Twilight, because Twilight was the one who raised him. And Spike then later told Twilight about that, and she was very much surprised because she had realized since she had heard about Redheart's former engagement that Spike has feeling sad after that he heard about it. So she put one thing together and she figured out that Spike was in love with Redheart. But even after some time, Spike's friends later found out about this, but they all kept this promise not to tell any other ponies. But only about a few months after they had entered this relationship, Redheart's former fiancée returned and then asked for forgiveness and asked if they could be brought back together. But Redheart explained to him that that would never happen because she had found somebody else. And then he asked who, but she didn't say. So he started spying on her, following her around to see who they could be. But most of the time she spent with her friends, with Spike, back and forward. He couldn't even figure out that Spike was the one that Redheart was together with. And after nearly following her around for nearly 3 whole weeks, he gave up and left Ponyville and never returned. He figured out if he couldn't find out who she was together with, or seeing at least, it was not worth the time spending more time just spying on her to find out who it could be. And nearly 10 years later, Spike was in his 20s, and even he was in his 20s, and Redheart was like in her 40s. Spike and Redheart later got married, and even if it was past the time that Redheart could be to have any children, but they decided to do this try, and they had at least one son, and he was half pony and half dragon. But they also had some more children. There was some complications during the birth, so they wouldn't risk it anymore. So they decided to adopt 2 daughters from a local orphanage. Spike and Redheart was very much happy to have their own family, even they had one biological child and 2 adopted. They very much still loved each other even so much. And Spike had in fact, over the time since they entered their relationship 10 years earlier, has still remained in the hospital to take care of the children. And even after they're married and after they got a family of their own, he still works at the hospital after taking care of the children. And even after to be Twilight's #1 assistant. And that's how Spike, Nurse Redheart, found a true love and got a big family. The end.